Thank you so much. I would like to, of course, start by thanking the National Armenian Committee for this invitation to speak tonight. I'm extremely honoured to speak at this event, following not only the distinguished speakers that we've had tonight, but the previous distinguished speakers who have spoken at this event, including my good friend and president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, Professor Henry Theriault. And hopefully I'll be following in his steps further by taking over the presidency after him. As the first female president too. I would also like to acknowledge the Camaragal people on whose lands we meet tonight and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Tonight I'm going to speak to you about social death, cultural destruction in the context of the Armenian Genocide, with a specific focus on culture in Western Armenia. But first, I wanted to give you an idea. I just have to check that we're working. I wanted to give you an idea of how I ended up in Western Armenia. In 2015, I was in Armenia at a Genocide Scholars Conference and also undertaking research in the National Archives and the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute. But I wanted to go and do field work on location. I wanted to see where the Armenian genocide happened. And it's really difficult to get to that area, to get to what is now eastern Turkey. It isn't exactly an area that's popular with tourists who all head to the other side of Turkey. So eventually I found an Armenian tour company that ran a tour that went to the exact places that I wanted to visit. So I contacted them, and they wrote back to me and they said, "We don't know yet when we're going to run the tour because it's not particularly popular. We don't know sometimes whether or not we're even going to run it." So I had to wait and see. And it was right before I actually left for Armenia that they contacted me and they said, good news, we're running a tour. And one of the difficulties at the time was where they would run the tour, because of course the conflict in Syria was getting closer and closer to the border with Turkey. So they said to me, "We've got this one tour running," which was wonderfully in the time that I was going to be there, "and we have one place on the French tour that we're running." And I looked at the email and I hit reply and I said, "Well, isn't it lucky that I'm fluent in French? Because otherwise I think I would have been in trouble." So there I was, ended up on this tour where we travelled from Armenia by land through Georgia into Turkey with a group of mostly retired French people. And it turns out French people complain a lot when they travel. So I ended up as this one Australian ring-in on a tour with this group of French friends. One of them had Armenian heritage, and he wanted to bring his friends to show them Armenia, and they decided to take this tour. And it's lucky they did, because otherwise I wouldn't have had the chance to go. So I'm really honoured to have been able to go there, as I'm yet to meet an Armenian who has had the chance to go to Western Armenia. And it meant that I could go to the places that I've read so much about in my studies and really make a connection and understand about what happened. Places like the Berkras River, which is one of the key points in the genocide, where women and children threw themselves into the river to avoid a worse fate at the hands of the Kurds. So the photographs in my presentation tonight are, with the exception of one sepia photo, are all my own photographs that I took travelling throughout Western Armenia. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish jurist, created the word genocide, and he envisioned it to be more than just physical destruction. He spoke of death, of course, but he also talked about concepts such as seizure of property, dehumanisation, and cultural death. He saw a crime that concerned the extermination of nations and ethnic groups through killing the intelligentsia, destruction of culture, transfer of wealth, depopulation of territory, and mass killing. When the Genocide Convention was created in the late 1940s, at the push of Raphael Lemkin, it was eventually, like all treaties are, a compromise on the text of the definition of genocide. It lists 5 crimes which are to be committed with intent to destroy a group. Much of the case law that has emerged from international courts and tribunals subsequently has focused on physical and biological destruction, despite the fact that the courts and tribunals also refer to group identity. In this sense, a group only exists as a group because of its cultural identity, as a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group. I believe the focus on physical destruction as the main component of genocide is erroneous. Members of the group may exist physically, but if they no longer retain the culture that made them the very group they were targeted for being, then genocide has been committed. Likewise, even if their culture is only destroyed in part. In the case of the Armenian genocide, this cultural loss is quite significant. During the lead up to the Armenian genocide, from the 1800s, Armenian culture was specifically targeted. This targeting was an integral part of the genocide process. For example, Armenians were prohibited from conducting their religious observance in ways that would disturb Muslims. For example, ringing of church bells or even building new churches. Religious leaders were prevented from fulfilling their duties. Armenian participation in sports was limited. Armenians were prevented from wearing valuable materials such as silk. And Armenian shoes and headwear had to be red in colour. In the 1900s, these restrictions escalated. Armenian schools were closed and Armenian language publications restricted. Schools and language were Turkified. Once the genocide began in earnest, education for Armenians was non-existent. Armenians were forcibly converted to Islam. Armenian churches and schools were plundered and burned. Churches were profaned and relics were plundered and burned. This is all an intrinsic part of the genocide. To take away culture was to take away Armenianness. Evidence of this cultural destruction still exists today, and in fact is proof that the genocide process continues long after the killing has stopped. Remnants of many Armenian sites that were destroyed in the genocide remain unrepaired and derelict, a mere memory of a lengthy history of the Armenians and Iratians. With travel into Turkey difficult to impossible for Armenians, the treatment of these sites is part of the genocide denial that Turkey continues with today. I would like to take you through some of these sites in Western Armenia. This is Sant Marie Church, built in the 7th century. Mush was an Armenian city that was destroyed in the genocide. This church was turned into a prison and then left to decay. Some old Armenian houses remain, but most were destroyed. Any Armenians who remain are Muslim, after their families were forcibly converted during the genocide. This is the area around the St. Marie Church in Mush, where you can see that there is little left apart from a few crumbling walls. Some nearby towns and villages, such as Sassoon, are still Armenian, but they're called Arabs by the Turks. And this is because many people fled to Syria and Persia during the genocide, and when they returned a decade later, they spoke Arabic. This hill is right near the church in Mush. An Armenian resistance hero was killed by the Turks and buried on this mountain. People didn't know where he was buried until the 1980s, when an old man revealed the burial location. However, nobody knows where the body is now, because the Turks did not want the site to be commemorated, and so they have possibly moved the body. Murat Bridge was originally built in the 13th century across the Euphrates East River near Mush. The strong current in this area makes it a notoriously difficult place to build a bridge. In the 4th century, when Christianity became the national religion of Armenia, Gregory the Illuminator baptized people in this river for conversion, using oil in the water. So it's a very historically important site for Armenians. The village that was near here no longer exists. In 1907, uprisings for freedom began, and a local hero, Govak Chauch, was killed at this bridge. In 1996, the Turks blew up this bridge to stop it being a site of pilgrimage for Armenians. It was rebuilt in 2009. These are the remnants of the house where celebrated Armenian writer Yegushe Charents lived in Kars until the genocide. A few years ago, it had a roof and it was for sale. Unsurprisingly, Armenians wanted to buy it, but of course then the Turks wouldn't sell, and now the house has been left to fall into ruin. This extraordinarily beautiful site is the 10th century St. Carapat or St. John the Baptist Church at a Firaga Bank monastery, one of the most picturesque spots that I have ever picnicked at. It looks over the Chevreuil or Roe-Deer mountains. The monastery was extremely important in the region, and it even had a school. This is inside the St. Carapat Church. You can see the destruction of the columns and the stonework. It reeked of cow dung because the locals use it to house their cattle and other animals. There was no village near this monastery. It was designed to be a remote refuge, as you can see from the amazing rural location in the background of this photo. Yet it was still plundered and attacked by the genocide, with the Turks going out of their way to attack this particular site. These are the remnants of one of the smaller churches on the site, the Church of St. David. One thing that remains here are the tallest khachkars in the world, at 6 metres tall, and I included a photo with me in it so you could see the scale of these amazing monuments here. There are 2 of them still standing, but one of them has fallen down, and you can see from the moss and the lichens that certainly no one is taking care of these beautiful monuments. Firaga Bank is an 11th century Armenian Apostolic Church monastery, not far from the city of Van. It was rebuilt in the 1300s and restored after an earthquake in the 1600s. Additions were made in the 1600s and 1800s, so it has a lengthy history. During the genocide, Turkish gendarmes killed the monastery's monks and servants, and they occupied the site for some time. After they left, it was used as a shelter for Armenian refugees. But in late April 1915, the Turkish army attacked, burned and destroyed most of the monastery, with villagers and refugees escaping to the city of Van. More of it was destroyed in the 1960s. Some of it, including a roof over the entrance, which is in the top left-hand corner photo, has collapsed in recent years due to neglect of the site. The monastery was confiscated during the genocide, and now a Turkish journalist and media executive, Fatih Altayli, claims that he owns it. There were rumours that a couple of years ago, the Turkish government wanted to destroy the remains of the site for further development, but I cannot confirm this particular rumour. Van Fortress and the ancient city of Ani are 2 sites that are somewhat cared for by the Turks. However, this care has included the Islamification of these Armenian structures. Van Fortress, built by the Iratians in the 9th to 7th centuries BC, has had an Islamic arch added in, and the Lion's Gate at Ani has had the cross removed from above the lion. Ani is first mentioned by Armenian chroniclers in the 5th century AD as a strong castle built on a hilltop and a possession of the Kamsarakan dynasty. It was a prominent city until its decline in the 14th century, with final abandonment in the mid-18th century. It was rediscovered by archaeologists in the late 18th century. During the genocide, attempts were made to evacuate items from the site, and luckily about 6,000 items were removed. However, anything that remained was either looted or destroyed. In 1921, the Soviets signed a treaty with the Turks, giving this area to Turkey. What was left of the Armenian population in these areas was forced to leave, and the still active medieval Armenian churches and monasteries were abandoned. The Akhurian or Arpa River became the new border between Turkey and Armenia. The river and Armenia are clearly visible from the city of Ani. Restoration of Ani has been highly criticised, with poor quality stonework being done, removal of original tiles and stones, and no attempts made at archaeological excavation despite the lengthy history of this site. UNESCO did fund some renovations, but once that funding stopped, so did the renovations. This is not a site in Western Armenia, but it's an image that I have found to be one of the most striking representations of cultural destruction. It's a billboard that was erected at Yerevan in 2015 as part of the 100th anniversary commemoration. And it really struck me because it shows a literal erasure of the Armenian language being written over by the then newly formed Turkish language as a perfect representation of what destruction of culture means. The sites that I've talked about today are but a few examples, but an important demonstration of how genocide is more than physical destruction. Some of these buildings are in a state where they could be rescued. Others have been left to disrepair, destroying significantly historical elements of Armenian culture. What is also striking is the destruction of the Armenian sites has continued even decades after the official end of the Armenian genocide, well into even the 21st century. This is proof that genocide does not end when the killing stops. The desire to eliminate a group is not just about physical destruction, but also cultural destruction. Destroying a group is not just about killing multiple individuals, but is the destruction of something more, a dynamic relational network formed through practical social interactions in historical time. Given that cultural attacks begin long before physical violence against the targeted group, cultural restrictions and destruction must be used as an early warning risk factor for genocide. In genocide scholarship, we refer to genocide as a process, not an event. This means that when cultural attacks start, so does the genocide. Eradicating culture is an integral part of this genocide process. So Lemkin's original concept of genocide remains highly relevant today and should be the definition taken up by courts and tribunals when they're interpreting the law. The current definition does not say physical destruction, it just says destruction. And in fact, some of the crimes listed as genocidal crimes are not about death or physical destruction, including causing serious mental harm to members of the group. And I think we can all agree that destruction of culture certainly causes serious mental harm to the group. Genocide scholar Daniel Firestein has referred to genocide as a specific technology of power for destroying and reorganising social relations, observing that it is impossible to commit genocide without first building models of identity and otherness. In the Krstic case, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia specifically noted that the goal of genocidaire, those who commit genocide, is to deprive humanity of the manifold richness its nationalities, races, ethnicities, and religions provide. In other words, it is the group as a cultural concept, a social structure that genocidaires seek to eliminate. Scholar Claudia Card describes genocide as social death, which comes through annihilation of social vitality, which only exists through relationships, including those mediated through social institutions such as religion. Members of the group lose their context and identity that shapes their lives. And I quote Card, "In genocides, survivors experience a social death to a degree and for a time. Some later become revitalised in new ways. Others do not. Descendants of genocide survivors, like descendants of slaves who were kidnapped, may be natally alienated, no longer able to pass along and build upon the traditions, cultural developments, including languages, and projects of earlier generations." I took this term, social death, from Card as the title of this talk because I feel it's particularly applicable to the Armenian genocide. The Armenian language was targeted through Turkification in education and restriction and denial of Armenian language publications. Armenians were forcibly converted, often the only way to ensure their physical survival. The Armenian Christian religion was specifically targeted for destruction, both the buildings and objects and the religious leaders. The Armenian people were pushed out of their land that Armenians and their ascendants, the Iratians, had inhabited for thousands of years. And I've included this map so you can see the dark outline of historical Armenia compared to how small it is today. With that exclusion from the land, which continues today, the history and culture of Armenia that remains in modern-day Turkey is, if not already dismantled and ravaged, certainly crumbling. Armenians are indeed natally alienated, no longer able to build upon or even visit those traditions, cultural developments, and projects of earlier generations that remain in Western Armenia. As long as denial by Turkey of the Armenian genocide continues, Armenian culture in Western Armenia will continue to disintegrate and eventually be completely gone until the genocide of the Armenians by the Turks is finally complete. Thank you.